I think there's three big differences. The first one is our presence here is much larger. We have one of the biggest booths of any blockchain company, if not the biggest here. We have over 10 people here talking to various banks, CSDs, asset managers, and others. And I think there's a huge amount of demand that we're seeing. The second thing is you have digital asset teams. So digital assets was not something people put in their title even a few years ago. There weren't dedicated digital asset teams. Blockchain stuff and digital asset stuff used to live in the innovation group of most banks, which means it was one of many experiments that may or may not have continued. And this is the process that many blockchain companies, including us, went through year after year, going through the innovation group. But now you have people with titles like head of digital assets, digital asset tech lead, and so on. So you have dedicated teams and team members whose entire job is to make digital assets successful for their bank. So that's a very big difference. And then the final difference, and the one that I think is both beneficial to banks and beneficial to the adoption of CCAP and Chainlink, is that this thesis that every bank will have a single chain and the counterparties, the clients, the users of that bank will all integrate with their chain, and that the bank will not need any other chain, is gone, right? So there used to be this whole theory that I'm a bank and I'm so big and important that I'm going to have my own chain and that's going to be it. I'm just going to use that one chain and everyone's going to come to my chain and be with me on my chain. Now banks are realizing that that's not realistic. And what's actually going to happen is that there are going to be hundreds of different chains. Every bank is going to have its own chain. And in order to transact with that bank, with the other bank, you're going to need to connect to that chain. If you don't connect to banks, if you don't connect to counterparties on their chain, then you won't have clients, you won't have users, you won't have liquidity, you won't have markets. If there are no markets, there's no point of making your assets. So while the first step might be making the market by creating the asset, the next step is getting liquidity, is getting value to flow into your asset by connecting it to multiple chains. And I think banks have realized this, as have the CSDs, the asset managers, various other market infrastructures, and this idea that you won't reach this state of either your own chain, having all the users come to you, or some magical global chain that all the banks are going to be on simultaneously. This idea going away makes it clear that something like CCIP is absolutely critical. And I think we're by far the farthest bridge technology and connectivity technology both into chains and across chains. And I think banks see that thanks to our work with SWIFT and DTCC and Euroclear and all the participants in the recent POC. The report we put out with them I think was also very helpful, and we have a lot more going on with a lot of the people in that report, and very excited how all that's progressing. In other words, this excites me, I'm excited. Sure, ANZ is a very forward-looking bank. They have over $1 trillion in assets under management, which is quite a bit. They're one of the biggest banks in their region. And I think they're also very innovative in what they're trying to do. So they are one of the banks pushing green assets and carbon credit assets, and they have a real, I think, leading position in their part of the world on that. What we did with them was there was a stablecoin created that was used for DVP, delivery versus payment, of a carbon credit green asset, which is called a reef credit, which is a carbon offset asset or an environmental offset asset related to the barrier reefs in Australia. And so there's a return for holding the asset because the asset represents a reduction in the chemicals that go out and damage the reefs. I think these types of assets are new assets coming into the financial industry. And new assets are actually easier to turn into blockchain-based token assets and tokenized real-world assets. So I think that's one of the reasons they went with that, because there isn't an accepted framework or an accepted standard for how to do that. But what we did there is we showed a few things. We were able to show that you can take one currency, turn it into another currency, turn that currency into a stable coin, move the stable coin to another chain where the real world asset relies, in this case, this reef credit. Then that reef credit gets sent back to the buying chain where the stable coin came from. And then the transaction is facilitated by CCIP throughout, both using the value transfer for the stable coin as well as the messaging to move various aspects of the asset. So I think it was a pretty big step forward, and I think the room was packed and there were a lot of people that were asking questions afterward, because there is real demand now. Real world asset tokenization is something that banks are uniquely positioned to do because they know how to package things into financial products very well. And they have access to huge amounts of various industries and corporations that want to package their assets into real world assets, right, into real world tokenized assets. And then I think initially they'll send those things over to other banks, but eventually they'll make their way into public chains where they'll be used as a way to diversify collateral. And diversifying collateral in public chains is quite critical because the overexposure to crypto collateral is large. And this leads to failures like Terra and other serious problems where the collateral is purely crypto based, and if crypto collateral goes down, the whole collateral base of a single protocol could be wiped out or reduced dramatically because there's basically not enough diversification of the collateral backing the protocol. And so I think real world asset tokens, like what ANZ has made and others beyond that, will be interesting to banks because the banks and their clients will want to buy it, and that'll create transactional throughput on bank chains, and that'll create more bank chain adoption. And I think that'll get more banks onto blockchains, so that'll be more stable coins and more real world assets appearing from there. But I think the eventual real market for real world assets is actually public chain DeFi that will pay a premium to diversify away the risk of only holding crypto assets and avoiding failure scenarios like Terra, which desperately needed to diversify their assets backing the protocol, which is the state that many other protocols are in. I think there's a lot of really exciting things that Chainlink can be used for in capital markets, starting from real world assets with things like proof of reserves, identity data, NAV, price, all these key inputs that make real world assets useful. Then CCIP, I think, is a critical component of providing liquidity and creating viable real markets for those assets made by banks. And I think banks are really starting to realize that if you make your own chain and you put an asset on your chain, you might end up in a situation where you don't have a market, you don't have liquidity, you don't have people wanting to buy your asset. If you don't have liquidity, you don't have a market, you don't have people wanting to buy your asset, why'd you make the asset? More importantly, why'd you even make the chain? So it's not just about making a chain of your own as a bank. It's not about just making an asset of your own as a bank. It's about getting that asset sold. It's about getting it into the hands of users. And those users are on other chains. Those clients are on other banks' chains. And this is really the realization that's driving a lot of CCIP adoption. The other great thing about CCIP is there is no chain. So a lot of the solutions that seek or want to create interoperability across capital markets and banks, what they're actually doing is they're injecting a chain in between banks, which will essentially act like settlement infrastructure. And banks do not need more settlement infrastructure in between them and their counterparties. It's just not something they're excited to do. A, there's a lot of settlement infrastructure already, and they're making their own chains for that purpose. And B, they kind of view it as a cost that they don't want or need. What they actually want is they want more usership, more liquidity, and they want to connect to their existing counterparties efficiently. And that's what CCIP is meant to do. CCIP doesn't have a chain. CCIP doesn't have any way to do settlement. It's just a way for one chain to send value or tokens to another chain together with a message that can trigger outcomes in that chain. And so it's actually much more advanced in its elegance and simplicity in that it serves the specific need that they have very well without creating this problem of injecting a blockchain in between them and the other bank. And this is what pretty much every other enterprise blockchain solution does, is it tries to say it does something else or it does interoperability or something, but what it's actually doing is it's injecting a blockchain in between two banks and trying to become the settlement infrastructure, which once again, banks have no interest in and won't be doing. Much more than that, CSDs, messaging systems like Swift, and various other key market players don't want another settlement system. They want to simply connect to their counterparty and transact. So that's another big thing that I'm seeing. And then finally, I'm seeing a good amount of legal clarity for banks to transact at least on a secondary market basis. So while they can't necessarily sell digital assets to every single client or to the general public, I am seeing enough clarity both in Europe and Asia, both for those groups of banks and market infrastructures, that they are able now to do what they call secondary market transactions. So they are able now to do transactions using digital assets for real value on production. And there's been a number of these kind of transactions that have now started gradually happening. And what they've realized from doing those transactions is they want to do more of them because there's a lot of demand for them, which is great. And B, they want to connect to more counterparties that want access to their assets or their stablecoin. And in order to do that, this problem of interoperability and connectivity is becoming central and key. I think initially the impact on DeFi will be not so large. It'll be muted because it won't be clear what the significance is. So initially it'll be kind of DeFi is doing its own thing and then banks are doing their own thing. Until a few of these banks end up putting stable coins or real world asset tokens into DeFi protocols. Then the picture will become quite clear, because if you do the basic math, the amount of value that banks and their client base can pump into DeFi is far and above the largest aggregation of value on the planet. And the thing that people sometimes have a problem with, in my experience, is until they see something, it's kind of hard for them to believe it. It's hard for them to imagine it. But I have to tell you, the logic, and this is where logic is quite useful, because with logic, you don't really need to see something to believe it. You can logically reason to what'll happen next. My logical reasoning tells me very clearly that both of these groups, the public chain DeFi group and the bank group, fundamentally are very, very similar. They both want to make money. They're both interested in financial products, and they're both driven primarily by generating returns for some kind of client base, while also managing risk. And I think they have a very good way to do that for each other. So the banks have a way to provide real-world assets to DeFi protocols in a way that diversifies the underlying collateral of those DeFi protocols, reducing their risks. And the DeFi protocols have a way to provide yield and returns to the banks for those assets. And also, I think there will be a very robust and increasingly growing stablecoin economy that involves both DeFi protocols and banks. And I think a lot of this will be driven by both the injection of proof of reserves data, price data, identity data, NAV data, various other critical types of data in order to make those assets better and better. And it'll be driven by interoperability and connectivity between the various banks and between the various DeFi projects. So what we're doing is we're building CCIP as an interoperability standard in both the public chain DeFi world and the private chain bank world simultaneously, right? Between these two worlds, there's a kind of wall. There's a big legal wall that still prevents them from transacting en masse. But you can still build an interoperability standard in public chain DeFi in the form of CCIP. And you can still build an interoperability standard in the form of CCIP on bank chains. And you can still get both of those separate groups to transact with each other in this efficient single interoperability standard in their respective ecosystems. So kind of creating two separate Internet of Contracts. And then eventually you arrive at a place where when the legal wall goes down, when their ability to transact with each other becomes clearer and simpler and less risky, then if they're both on the same interoperability standard, you will have, I think, massive transaction flows between those two groups, because they're fundamentally both involved in the same activity. They're making financial products. They want to transact with more end users. They want more liquidity. And they're all chasing returns while also wanting to reduce their risk by diversifying through other asset types. And so, to me, logically, it's very clear that once that legal barrier goes down, they will transact massively between each other. And so CCIP is not only getting adopted on public chains, not only on private bank chains, but very importantly, we hope and we're working towards eventually getting it to be the transactional layer between these two groups. And I think when that happens, you'll actually arrive at a world where you have a single global internet of contracts, just like you have a single global internet that includes both startups and banks, because they can connect to each other efficiently and with legal frameworks that allow them to conduct transactions with each other. Yeah, absolutely. I'm always very grateful to the community for their support and their understanding about what it takes to build a secure, reliable system that can be adopted by people with high security standards. I think the thing that everyone should really keep in mind is that there hasn't been a system in history that hasn't become successful without securing the value, right? So you can take Swift. 50 years the system has been working well because it can secure value reliably. That's why people put their value in there. When the cloud appeared, the cloud came to be something that people put information and valuable data into because Amazon Web Services S3 was reliable and secure, right? So it was secure from attacks and it was reliable in that it was always largely available. And so this is the standard that our industry needs to meet and we need to meet. And it's one thing to build a single service or some simple thing that you slap together and you ship it. But that thing may very well not be reliable. It might not stay up, and it might not be secure. So what we're really doing is we're working with the best academics, the best security researchers, an amazing team. Your help from the community is obviously critical, and everybody's working together to build a secure, reliable standard, which does take time. The good news for us actually is that right now the adoption curve is not massive. It's not like DeFi summer. And so there's actually time to sit down and architect the system properly into this Chainlink 2.0 state. So while I'm also very eager to get to a better collection of features, more capabilities, I think it's very important to do it in a secure and reliable way so that as the value in the system increases, the system continues to function and the system continues to be secure and reliable. And that is a difficult challenge. That is a serious challenge that a lot of systems don't always overcome. And I think we and everyone in the community is doing our best, and we hope that we can meet that high standard, and we hope that we can meet it in time for all the value that's going to flow into it to connect with the right level of security and usability. So I think I'm always very grateful to this community for their support. I'm grateful to them for their understanding what it takes to build a secure and reliable system. And I think it's very important that we do it together. SmartCon is coming up. I'm really excited about that. And I think we just have a great team at Chainlink Labs. We have a great bunch of teams in the community. And I think I'm just really thrilled to be working on this and very grateful to all the people that are working together with me on this in various ways. So in other words, thank you.